That man hasn't worn a uniform in 4 decades, and he just did what 6 months of drill training couldn't. Those words, spoken by a 2-star general standing at the edge of a military cemetery, would become the most talked about moment at Arlington's sister installation in over 20 years. But before that moment arrived, before the cameras caught it, and before grown soldiers wiped tears from their faces, there was only silence. Broken silence. Misfire after misfire. A sacred ceremony falling apart in front of a grieving family who deserved perfection and were getting chaos instead. What happened next proved that some voices never lose their authority, and some soldiers never truly retire. If this story moves you, comment Cadence right now and let's get into it. Harold Raymond Tate was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself anymore. At 76 years old, he had earned the right to be invisible. He lived alone in a small brick house on the outskirts of Fort Logan, Colorado. The kind of house with an American flag out front that got replaced the moment it showed the slightest fraying. His lawn was trimmed with geometric precision, even though his knees ached every time he knelt. His shoes were polished even when he was only walking to the mailbox. These were not habits he had chosen. They had been installed in him decades ago, bolted into his nervous system by the United States Army, and they had never loosened. Harold had served 31 years. He enlisted at 17 with a forged signature from a father who was too drunk to notice or care, and by the time he was 23, he had already been promoted to the rank that would define his entire existence. Drill sergeant, not just any drill sergeant. Harold Raymond Tate had been one of the most feared and respected voices at Fort Benning during the late 1970s and through the 1980s, a period when the Army was rebuilding itself from the wreckage of Vietnam and needed men who could forge steel out of confusion. Harold was that forge. His voice could strip paint off walls. His cadence calls were so precise that entire battalions could march to them without a single misstep. Soldiers who trained under him said his voice didn't just reach your ears, it entered your spine, it reorganized your skeleton, it told your legs when to move and your lungs when to breathe, and God help you if you fell out of step because that voice would find you like a guided missile. He retired as a command sergeant major in 2003, after deployments that spanned Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, and 2 rotations in the early stages of Iraq. His body carried the evidence, a slight limp in his left leg from shrapnel he took during Desert Storm, hearing loss in his right ear from a mortar that landed too close outside Baghdad, arthritis that had turned his hands into weather forecasters, aching before every storm, and a cane. A simple black aluminum cane with a rubber grip that he leaned on more than he liked to admit. Harold hated that cane. It represented everything the Army had not prepared him for, which was growing old. He could still press his uniform in under 4 minutes. He could still recite the soldier's creed without pausing to think. But he could not walk across a parking lot without that cane, and every morning when he picked it up from its spot beside his nightstand, he felt a small piece of his dignity chip away. The funeral was for Master Sergeant David Allen Whitfield, a man Harold had never met but whose service record he had read in the obituary published in the local veterans newsletter. Whitfield had served 24 years, including tours in Afghanistan and a Bronze Star for actions in Helmand Province. He had died at 61 from pancreatic cancer, the kind of death that gave no warning and showed no mercy, and he had requested a full military honours funeral at Fort Logan National Cemetery. Harold made it a point to attend military funerals whenever he could. Not because he knew the deceased. He almost never did. He went because he believed that no soldier should be buried without a full audience, that the rows of headstones deserved witnesses, and that his presence, even as an old man leaning on a cane in the back row, added one more body to the count of people who gave a damn. He arrived early that Tuesday morning, dressed in a dark suit with his Command Sergeant Major lapel pin, and a small American flag pin on the opposite side. The October air was sharp and carried the smell of turned earth and dried leaves. The cemetery stretched out in perfect rows, white headstones standing at attention the way their occupants once had. And Harold felt what he always felt when he came to places like this, a sense of order, a sense of purpose, a sense that even in death the military maintained its formation. He parked his truck in the visitor's lot and made his way slowly along the paved path toward the burial site. He could see the setup from a distance, the canopy, the chairs arranged for the family, the flag-draped casket already positioned on the lowering device, and off to the side, in a clearing between 2 rows of graves, the ceremonial rifle squad. 7 soldiers in dress uniforms standing in a loose formation with their rifles. Harold settled himself on a bench about 40 yards from the burial site, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unintrusive. He placed his cane across his knees and watched. The funeral was scheduled for 1100 hours. It was currently 09:45, and the rifle squad was running through their rehearsal. Harold had seen hundreds of these ceremonies during his career. He had overseen dozens of them personally. The 21-gun salute was not complicated in theory. 7 rifles, 3 volleys, each volley fired in unison, creating a single thunderous crack that echoed across the cemetery and told the world that a warrior was being laid to rest. The timing had to be perfect. Not close, not almost. Perfect. Because the family sitting 20 feet away would hear every fraction of a second between those shots, and any gap, any stagger, any hesitation would turn a sacred tribute into an embarrassment. The squad leader, a young staff sergeant who looked to be about 27 or 28, was standing at the right flank with his sabre drawn, calling the commands. Harold watched him give the order. Ready. The 7 soldiers brought their rifles to the present position. Aim. They raised the rifles to their shoulders. Fire. What followed was not a volley. It was a stammer. 4 rifles fired within a reasonable window. 2 fired a beat late. 1 fired so late that it sounded like an afterthought, a lonely pop that trailed behind the group like a straggler on a road march. The staff sergeant's jaw tightened. He reset the squad and ran it again. This time was marginally better, but still unacceptable. The shots came in 2 clusters with a visible gap between them, and Harold could see the frustration building in the squad leader's posture. His shoulders were rising. His commands were getting sharper, more clipped, as if volume alone could solve a timing problem. Harold's fingers tightened around his cane. He said nothing. He watched. The 3rd rehearsal was worse than the first. Something had gotten into the squad's collective rhythm, a hesitation that was now feeding on itself. Each soldier was second-guessing the timing, waiting a fraction of a second to hear someone else fire first, and that fraction multiplied across 7 rifles and produced a ragged, staggered mess that sounded more like microwave popcorn than a military tribute. Harold closed his eyes and listened to the 4th attempt. Same result. He opened his eyes and looked at the burial site where the family would soon be sitting. He thought about Master Sergeant Whitfield, 24 years, a Bronze Star, pancreatic cancer, and this was the send-off he was going to get. The squad leader called his soldiers in and began speaking to them in a low voice that Harold couldn't hear from his bench. He could see the body language, though. The staff sergeant was animated, gesturing with his hands, pointing at individual soldiers. 2 of the younger soldiers were staring at the ground. One was adjusting his rifle sling repeatedly, a nervous habit. Harold recognized all of it. He had seen it 1,000 times in basic training. The symptoms of a group that had lost its internal clock. Every formation, every drill, every coordinated military action depended on one thing that could not be taught from a manual: cadence. The internal metronome that allowed a group of individuals to become a single organism. It was the heartbeat of the military, the invisible thread that connected every boot hitting the ground, every hand snapping to a salute, every trigger finger squeezing at the same microsecond. And this squad had lost it. The staff sergeant reset them into formation and tried again. Ready, aim, fire! The volley cracked out like a handful of gravel thrown against a window, scattered, uneven, broken. Harold heard a sound from behind him and turned slightly. A woman in a black dress was walking up the path with 2 teenagers beside her, the widow. She was arriving early, probably wanting a moment alone with the casket before the other mourners came. Harold watched her face as she walked, and he saw what he always saw in the faces of military widows. Exhaustion held together by duty. She had probably been awake since 4 in the morning, probably had not slept properly in weeks, and she was walking toward her husband's grave with the kind of rigid posture that said she would not cry in public even if it killed her. She glanced toward the rifle squad as she passed, and Harold saw her register the sound of another botched rehearsal volley. Her expression didn't change, but her step faltered for just a moment. One brief hitch in her stride, and that was enough. Harold stood up. He didn't make a decision to stand. His body made the decision for him, the way it had made every important decision in his career. His knees protested, his left hip sent a sharp warning signal. His cane nearly slipped from his grip as he pushed himself off the bench. But he was standing, and once Harold Raymond Tate was standing, he was moving, because standing still without purpose was something that had been drilled out of him before he could legally buy a beer. He walked toward the rifle squad, slowly, his cane tapped against the paved path with a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap was exactly the same interval as the last, because even Harold's walking pace had cadence. The staff sergeant saw him approaching, and his expression shifted from frustration to confusion to something close to irritation. Another old veteran coming to offer unsolicited advice. He probably dealt with it at every ceremony. Old men who used to serve and who couldn't resist telling young soldiers what they were doing wrong. Harold understood the look. He would have given the same look 20 years ago. But Harold was not coming to offer advice. He was coming to fix a problem, and there was a difference between those two things that the young staff sergeant was about to learn. Harold stopped at the edge of the formation, about 6 feet from the left flank soldier. He was close enough to be heard, but far enough to not be in the way. The staff sergeant turned to him fully now, squaring his shoulders in a way that was meant to establish authority. "Sir, this is a closed rehearsal. The ceremony begins at 1100 hours. If you could please return to the seating area." Harold looked at him, just looked. His eyes were brown, almost black, and they had a weight to them that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with 31 years of staring down soldiers who thought they knew better. "You're losing them on the squeeze," Harold said. His voice was calm, not loud, not aggressive, just factual, the way a mechanic would tell you that your alternator was shot. "They're listening for each other instead of listening for you. That's why the timing is drifting. You need to give them something to lock onto." The staff sergeant blinked. "Sir, I appreciate the concern, but we've got this handled. If you could please—" "You don't have it handled, son." Harold said it without malice, without condescension. He said it the way gravity would say it if gravity could talk. A simple statement of physical fact. You've run it 5 times, and each volley has been worse than the last because frustration is contagious, and your squad is swimming in it. That family is going to be seated in about 35 minutes, and right now you're going to give them a sound that belongs at a county fair, not a military funeral. The staff sergeant's face reddened. Behind him, 2 of the soldiers exchanged a glance. Harold could see the calculation happening in the young man's eyes. Argue with the old civilian and waste more time, or swallow pride and listen for 30 seconds. Pride was winning. Harold could see it. So he did what he had always done when pride was the obstacle. He removed it from the equation. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather case. He opened it and held it where the staff sergeant could see it. Inside was a retired military identification card, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. Command Sergeant Major Harold R. Tate, United States Army. Below the ID was his drill sergeant badge, the distinctive insignia that had been pinned to his chest for more years than this staff sergeant had been alive. The young man's eyes moved from the ID to the badge to Harold's face. Something changed. Not everything, but something. A small door opened where a wall had been. "Command Sergeant Major," the staff sergeant said, and his voice had shifted down about half an octave without him realizing it. "You didn't know," Harold said, closing the case and putting it back in his pocket. "No reason you should have. I'm just an old man on a bench, but right now that's not what matters. What matters is that Master Sergeant Whitfield is about to be laid to rest, and he earned a clean volley. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand right here on the left flank. I'm not going to touch a rifle. I'm not going to give your commands. That's your job, and I respect it. But between your commands, I'm going to count cadence. 1 count between ready and aim, 1 count between aim and fire. Your soldiers are going to listen to that count, and they're going to fire on the beat, not on each other. That's all. You still run the show. I'm just the metronome." The staff sergeant looked at his squad. They were watching this exchange with the kind of attention that soldiers give to things that matter. Every one of them was still. Every one of them was listening. He looked back at Harold. "Roger that, Sergeant Major." Harold positioned himself at the left flank, about 3 feet behind the last soldier in line. He planted his cane into the soft ground beside him and stood as straight as his body would allow. His left leg trembled slightly under the strain, but he locked the knee and ignored it. He had stood at attention in worse pain than this. He had stood at attention with shrapnel in his thigh and blood pooling in his boot. A little arthritis was nothing. The staff sergeant returned to his position on the right flank and drew his sabre. He looked down the line. The 7 soldiers were reset, rifles at their sides, eyes forward. But there was something different now. Harold could feel it. The nervous energy that had been crackling through the formation like static electricity was settling. The soldiers were not looking at him. Military discipline prevented that. But they were aware of him the way you're aware of a lighthouse when you're in a small boat in rough water. You don't stare at it. You just know it's there, and that knowledge alone changes your relationship with the darkness. "Ready," the staff sergeant commanded. 7 rifles came to the present position, and then Harold's voice filled the cemetery. 1, 2. It was not a shout. It was not a bark. It was something entirely different, something that exists in a space between sound and force. Harold's voice had been forged in the red Georgia clay of Fort Benning, tempered by 31 years of parade grounds and motor pools and rifle ranges and combat zones. It had called cadence for more soldiers than he could count. It had carried across open fields and through concrete barracks and over the roar of helicopter rotors. It had been the last human sound that many young soldiers heard before they marched into danger, and it had been the first sound they heard when they came back. Time had taken many things from Harold Raymond Tate. It had taken his wife, Carol, who passed in 2016 from a stroke. It had taken his mobility, his hearing in one ear, and his ability to open a jar of pickles without cursing. But it had not taken his voice. That voice came out of him now like something that had been waiting, and it crossed the cemetery in a wave that seemed to silence every other sound. The birds stopped. The wind paused. Even the distant hum of the highway traffic seemed to pull back and make room. "Aim!" the staff sergeant commanded. 7 rifles rose to 7 shoulders. 1, 2. Harold's count was metronomic. Exactly the same interval, exactly the same tone, exactly the same force. It was not a suggestion. It was a law of nature. It was the rotation of the earth expressed in 2 syllables. Fire. 7 triggers squeezed as one. The sound that erupted from those 7 rifles was a single unified crack that split the morning air and rolled across the headstones like thunder. It was so clean, so perfectly synchronized, that it was impossible to distinguish 7 separate shots. It sounded like God clapping once. Harold felt it in his chest. He felt it the way he had always felt it, as a physical force that entered through the sternum and exited through the spine, and for a fraction of a second he was not 76 years old. He was not leaning on a cane in a borrowed suit. He was 23 again, standing in front of a formation of terrified recruits, and his voice was the only thing in the universe that mattered. "Ready?" the staff sergeant called again. His voice was stronger now, feeding off the energy that Harold had injected into the formation. 1, 2. Aim. 1, 2. Fire. Another perfect crack. One sound, one moment, one tribute. Somewhere behind them, Harold heard a sharp intake of breath. The widow. She was standing near the canopy with her 2 teenagers, and she had heard the difference. Harold didn't turn around. He kept his eyes forward. 1 more volley. Ready? 1, 2. Aim. 1, 2. Fire. The 3rd volley was, if anything, even more precise than the first 2. The rifles fired with such unity that the echo bounced off the distant tree line and came back as a single return, like the cemetery itself was answering with a volley of its own. 21 shots. 3 volleys of 7. Perfect. The way it was supposed to be. The way Master Sergeant David Allen Whitfield deserved. The echo of the final volley faded into the October air, and silence reclaimed the cemetery. Harold stood motionless for several seconds, his hand still gripping the top of his cane which he hadn't touched during the volleys. Then, slowly, he relaxed his posture and allowed the cane to take his weight again. His left knee was screaming, his hip was sending distress signals. He didn't care. The staff sergeant sheathed his sabre and walked the length of the formation toward Harold. His face was different now. The frustration was gone. The irritation was gone. What was there instead was something that Harold had seen on the faces of soldiers for over 3 decades. A particular expression that happened when a young person realized they had just been in the presence of something they might spend their entire career trying to become. "Sergeant Major," the staff sergeant said, and he stopped in front of Harold and came to attention. Not casually, parade ground attention, heels together, chin up, arms at his sides. He rendered a salute that was crisp enough to cut glass. Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he returned the salute. Slowly. his arm coming up at the exact angle specified in Army Regulations 600-25, the way he had done it 1,000,000 times, the way his muscles remembered even when his joints protested. He held it for 2 full seconds and then brought it down. "You've got a good squad," Harold said. "They just needed an anchor. Now they've got the feel of it. They won't lose it." The staff sergeant's eyes were bright. He was fighting something back, some emotion that his training told him didn't belong on a parade ground. "Roger that, Sergeant Major. Thank you." Harold nodded once. "Thank your soldiers. They did the work. I just counted." He turned to leave, but the soldiers in the formation had other ideas. Without a command, without a word spoken between them, all 7 members of the rifle squad came to attention and rendered a salute toward Harold. He was 15 feet away by then, already moving back toward his bench with his cane tapping its steady rhythm. He stopped, turned, saw the 7 salutes. His jaw tightened. He returned the salute one more time, held it, dropped it, and then turned away before anyone could see what was happening behind his eyes. The funeral began precisely at 1100 hours. The mourners filed in. The chaplain spoke. The flag was folded with 13 precise folds, each one representing something that the soldiers folding it understood in their bones, even if they couldn't always put it into words. When the time came for the 21-gun salute, the rifle squad stepped into position with a different energy than they had carried during rehearsal. They were not nervous. They were not second-guessing. They moved like a single organism, the way Harold had described it, and when the staff sergeant gave his commands, Harold's cadence count was already inside them. They didn't need him standing at the flank anymore. His voice had planted itself in their internal clocks, and it was ticking away in perfect time, and they fired 3 volleys that sounded like the end of the world delivered in 3 clean chapters. The widow sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap. After the 3rd volley she closed her eyes and tilted her head back slightly, and a single tear ran down her right cheek. Not from grief this time, from gratitude. From knowing that the sound she had just heard was worthy of the man who was being lowered into the ground. The kind of sound that said the world still knew how to honour its own. Harold watched from his bench. He had moved back to it before the ceremony started, resuming his position as an anonymous spectator. An old man on a bench with a cane across his knees. Nobody in the mourning party knew who he was. Nobody in the family had seen what happened during rehearsal. And that was fine. Harold had not stepped forward for recognition. He had stepped forward because a soldier deserved clean volleys and the squad needed an anchor. Purpose served, mission complete. But someone had been watching. Brigadier General Elaine Catherine Marsh had arrived at the cemetery 20 minutes before the ceremony, sitting in the back of a dark sedan that was parked along the service road behind the tree line. She had come to pay her respects to Master Sergeant Whitfield, who had served under her command in Afghanistan. She was not in uniform. She wore a dark civilian suit and sunglasses, and she had intended to observe the ceremony quietly and leave without fanfare. From her position near the service road, she had witnessed the entire rehearsal disaster. She had watched the volleys disintegrate over 5 attempts. She had seen the frustration, the nervous adjustments, the growing despair in the squad leader's body language. She had been on the verge of sending her aide to intervene when she saw something that made her stay her hand. An old man getting up from a bench, walking slowly toward the formation with a cane, speaking to the staff sergeant, showing something from a leather case, and then positioning himself at the flank and producing a voice that Brigadier General Marsh felt in her sternum from 70 yards away. She had watched the 3 rehearsal volleys land like hammer strikes. She had watched 7 soldiers transform from a collection of nervous individuals into a precision instrument in the span of about 90 seconds, and she had not moved from her position, because she understood that she was watching something that did not need her intervention. It was already perfect. After the ceremony concluded and the mourners began to disperse, General Marsh stepped out of her sedan and walked across the grass toward the burial site. Her aide, a young captain, followed 3 steps behind. She intercepted the staff sergeant as he was overseeing the rifle squad's departure. "Staff sergeant," she said, and the young man snapped to attention so fast he nearly dropped his sabre. "Ma'am, General, I didn't realize you were at ease." She looked toward the bench where Harold was still sitting, watching the last of the mourners file past the grave. "That man, the one with the cane, who counted Cadence for your squad? Who is he?" The staff sergeant followed her gaze. "Command Sergeant Major Harold Tate, ma'am, retired. He was watching the rehearsal and offered to help. He He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He fixed us, ma'am. In about 2 minutes he fixed a problem we'd been fighting all week." General Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that the staff sergeant would remember for the rest of his career. "That voice. Where has that voice been for the last 40 years? The staff sergeant didn't have an answer. General Marsh didn't expect one. She was already walking toward the bench. Harold saw her coming. He recognized the bearing before he saw the rank. Military officers carried themselves differently than civilians, even when they weren't in uniform. There was a particular quality to the walk, a controlled economy of movement that said everything about who they were without a word being spoken. He started to rise, but she held up a hand. "Stay seated, Sergeant Major. That's not a request." She sat down on the bench beside him. Not across from him, beside him. Close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Harold was unsure how to read the situation. He didn't know who she was other than someone with stars, and he was momentarily uncomfortable with the proximity and the informality. "General Marsh," she said, as if she had read his mind. "Elaine, I was Master Sergeant Whitfield's brigade commander in 2012. Harold nodded. He had a good record, deserved a clean send-off. He got one, thanks to you. Harold shook his head slightly. "The squad did the work, I just counted Cadence. Yes, I heard. I also heard that voice from 70 yards away through a car window, and it straightened my own spine. I've been in the army for 32 years, Sergeant Major, and I've never heard Cadence called like that. Not once." Harold was quiet. He looked out across the headstones. "It's just timing," he said. "That's all it ever was. You give soldiers a rhythm they can trust and they'll follow it anywhere. Off a cliff if you let them. The trick is making sure you're leading them somewhere worth going." General Marsh studied his profile. The deep lines in his face, the careful way he held his cane, the lapel pin that identified his rank even in retirement. "How long since you've been on an installation in any official capacity?" Harold thought about it. 23 years this past March. Retired out of Fort Hood in 03. Haven't been back since." 23 years, she repeated. "And you can still stop a formation cold and make 7 soldiers fire as one. Some things don't leave you, ma'am. The body forgets. The voice remembers." She let that settle. Then she reached into her jacket and produced a business card. She held it out to Harold, and he took it, turning it over in his hands. "Brigadier General Elaine C. Marsh, Office of the Installation Commander, Fort Carson, Colorado." "I run Fort Carson," she said. "We train ceremonial units, honor guards, drill teams, funeral details. We send soldiers to Arlington. We send them to national cemeteries across the country, and every single one of those soldiers could benefit from 30 minutes with a voice like yours." Harold looked at the card. Then he looked at her. "I'm 76 years old, General. I use a cane. I can't run. I can't march. I can't do half the things I used to do. I don't need you to run, Sergeant Major. I don't need you to march. I need you to stand in front of a formation and open your mouth. That's it. That's all. Because what came out of your mouth today was the most effective piece of military instruction I've witnessed in my entire career, and it lasted about 6 seconds." Harold didn't answer right away. He looked out across the cemetery at the rows of white headstones that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Each one represented a soldier. Each one represented a story. Some of those stories had been told at ceremonies with perfect volleys and precise drill, and some had been told at ceremonies where the squad was nervous and the timing was off and the tribute fell short of what the soldier deserved. Harold had no illusions about his own importance. He was one old man with a loud voice and a cane and a lifetime of muscle memory that would eventually fade like everything else. But the voice was still there. Right now, today, the voice was still there. And as long as it was, he knew he had an obligation to use it. Not for himself. For the soldiers in the ground and the soldiers standing above them, trying to get it right. "I'll think about it," he said. General Marsh nodded. She had commanded enough soldiers to know when "I'll think about it" meant yes. She stood up, offered her hand, and Harold took it. Her grip was firm. His grip was firmer. 31 years of firm. "It was an honor to meet you, Sergeant Major Tate." "Likewise, General." She walked away. Her aide fell in step behind her. Harold sat on the bench and watched them go. Then he looked down at the business card in his hand and turned it over one more time. He slipped it into the breast pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where he kept his retired ID and his drill sergeant badge. Close to the chest, where the important things lived. 2 weeks later, Harold drove to Fort Carson. He told himself he was just going to look around, maybe have lunch at the post exchange, maybe watch a formation from the parking lot. He was not committing to anything, he was just looking. But the moment he stepped out of his truck and heard the distant sound of boots on pavement, the rhythmic crunch of a platoon in formation somewhere beyond the motor pool, something shifted inside him. A gear engaged that had been idle for 23 years. He found General Marsh's office. He sat across from her desk. She offered him coffee in an army mug that had the Fort Carson crest on it. He accepted it. She presented her proposal. 3 days a week, 2 hours each session, working with the ceremonial training platoon, no physical requirements beyond standing and speaking, his own parking spot near the training field, a stipend that Harold tried to refuse and that General Marsh informed him was non-negotiable because the army didn't accept volunteer labour for instructional positions. Harold looked at the mug in his hands. He looked at the wall behind General Marsh's desk, where photographs of unit formations hung in neat rows. He looked at the window, through which he could see a drill pad where a group of soldiers was practicing manual of arms. Their timing was off. He could hear it from inside the building. The slap of hands on rifle stocks was staggered, uneven, arrhythmic. It sounded like applause at a concert instead of a drill movement. "When do I start?" he asked. General Marsh smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. "How about right now?" Harold walked out onto that drill pad with his cane in his right hand and nothing else. No rank on his collar, no stripes on his sleeve. Just a 76-year-old man in a polo shirt and pressed khakis, moving slowly toward a formation of 30 soldiers who had no idea who he was or why he was there. Their platoon sergeant, a sergeant first class with a combat infantry badge and a ranger tab, watched Harold approach with the particular mix of courtesy and skepticism that career NCOs reserve for retired soldiers. "Sergeant Major Tate," the platoon sergeant said. Word had come down from General Marsh's office. He knew the name, he just didn't know the legend. "At ease," Harold said. It was the first command he had given on a military installation in 23 years, and it came out of him as if he had given it 23 seconds ago. The formation responded instantly, not because they knew him, because the voice knew them. It found the frequency that every soldier has tuned into since the first day of basic training, the frequency that says this sound means authority, and you will respond to it. "My name is Command Sergeant Major Tate. Retired. I'm here because General Marsh seems to think I have something to offer. I'm not here to waste your time or mine. I'm not here to tell you war stories. I'm here because every soldier who gets buried in a national cemetery deserves a ceremony that sounds like the United States Army gave a damn. And right now, from what I heard through that window, you're about 30% short of that standard." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Harold shifted his weight onto his cane and continued. "Drill is not about memorizing steps. You already know the steps. Drill is about time. It's about every one of you occupying the same millisecond. It's about 30 separate heartbeats becoming one heartbeat. And the only way to get there is cadence. Not my cadence. Not your platoon sergeant's cadence. The cadence. The one that lives underneath all the noise, underneath the nerves and the ego and the morning coffee and the argument you had with your spouse. There's a rhythm under all of that, and your job is to find it and lock onto it and never let go. I'm going to help you find it. That's it. That's the entire class. Now let's get to work." He counted cadence for 2 hours that first day. By the end of the first hour, the platoon's manual of arms was crisp enough to satisfy a parade inspection. By the end of the second hour, their marching cadence was so unified that the sound of their boots on the drill pad created a single resonant boom with each step, the kind of sound that you felt in your molars. Harold stood at the edge of the formation the entire time. His cane was planted in the ground beside him like a flagpole. His voice never wavered, it never cracked, it never softened. It filled the drill pad and bounced off the buildings and carried across the installation, and soldiers in other units who were walking between buildings stopped and turned their heads and listened, because they had never heard anything quite like it. A sound from another era. A sound that reminded them why they had raised their right hand and sworn an oath. At the end of the session, the platoon sergeant walked over to Harold and stood in front of him. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. "Sergeant Major," he said, "I've been doing this for 14 years. Nobody ever explained it like that." Harold looked at him. "Nobody needed to explain it, son. You already knew it. You just forgot you knew it. That happens when the drill becomes routine instead of ritual. A routine is something you go through. A ritual is something that goes through you. Make every formation a ritual, and you'll never lose the timing. The platoon sergeant nodded slowly. He would repeat that line to every soldier he trained for the next 20 years of his career, and he would credit it to the old man with a cane every single time. Harold Tate spent the next 3 years working with the ceremonial training platoon at Fort Carson. 3 days a week, 2 hours each session, never missed a day. Not when the arthritis flared so badly he could barely grip his cane. Not when a Colorado blizzard dropped 14 inches of snow overnight. Not when he caught pneumonia in the second winter and his doctor told him to rest for 2 weeks, and he rested for 3 days, and then drove to the post with a thermos of hot tea and a voice that sounded like gravel being poured into a steel drum. The soldiers he trained went on to serve at Arlington, at national cemeteries across the country, at state funerals, at ceremonies for Medal of Honor recipients and fallen presidents, and soldiers who died in training accidents at 20 years old. And every one of those soldiers carried Harold's voice inside them. Not the sound of it, but the principle of it. The idea that timing was not a skill but a commitment. That cadence was not a count but a covenant between soldiers. That every time they stood in formation and raised a rifle or drew a saber or folded a flag, they were making a promise to the person in the casket. And that promise had to be kept with absolute precision because the dead could not ask for a do-over. The staff sergeant from that October morning at Fort Logan National Cemetery, the one who had struggled with the volleys, was eventually promoted to Sergeant First Class and was assigned to the ceremonial platoon at Fort Carson. He trained under Harold for 11 months. On his last day before transferring to a new assignment, he found Harold sitting in his usual spot near the drill pad, drinking coffee from the same army mug that General Marsh had given him on his first day. "Sergeant Major," the newly promoted Sergeant First Class said, "I want you to know something. That morning at Fort Logan when you walked over with your cane and I almost told you to go sit down, that was the single most important moment of my career. Not because of what you taught me about cadence, because of what you taught me about never assuming that the most important person in the room is the one wearing the most rank." Harold sipped his coffee. "I wasn't the most important person in that room," he said. "The most important person was in the casket." The Sergeant First Class nodded. "Roger that, Sergeant Major." Harold Raymond Tate continued his work at Fort Carson until his body finally issued an order that even his voice couldn't overrule. A fall on the ice outside his house in the winter of his 79th year broke his hip and forced a recovery that took months instead of weeks. He returned to the drill pad one final time the following spring, leaning on a walker instead of a cane, and he counted cadence for one last session. His voice was unchanged. If anything, it had gotten deeper, as if time were compressing it into something denser and more powerful. The soldiers in formation that day would later say it was the best cadence they had ever heard. Not the loudest, the best. Because it carried something extra, a finality, a weight, the knowledge that this sound was being offered for the last time, and that it had to count for everything it had ever meant. When the session ended, Harold turned the walker toward the parking lot. Behind him, the entire platoon stood at attention without being told. The platoon sergeant called the command, "Present arms!" 30 soldiers saluted the old man as he walked away. Harold heard the command. He stopped. He did not turn around this time. He simply raised his right hand to his brow, held the salute for 3 full seconds, and then dropped it and kept walking. His arm was steady, his step was not. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere across the country at that very moment, a rifle squad was firing 3 clean volleys over a soldier's grave, and the cadence inside those soldiers' heads was a voice that belonged to a 76-year-old man who had once gotten up from a bench because a widow's step had faltered. That voice would echo across military cemeteries for generations, not because it was loud, because it was right. And in the army, being right on time is the only thing that matters. Some people believe that heroism only exists on battlefields, that the only moments worth honouring are the ones marked by gunfire and sacrifice, and split-second decisions under enemy fire. But there is another kind of heroism, the kind that shows up at a cemetery on a Tuesday morning with a cane and a worn suit and a pair of lapel pins. The kind that watches 6 botched volleys and says nothing, and then watches a widow's step falter and says everything. Harold Raymond Tate did not save lives that day at Fort Logan. He did not charge a position or call in air support or drag a wounded soldier to cover. He stood at the flank of a formation and counted to 2. Twice, that's all. And in doing so, he gave a dead soldier the farewell he earned, gave a grieving family the sound they needed, and gave 7 young soldiers a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is the kind of quiet, stubborn, unyielding service that this country was built on, and it doesn't get enough credit because it doesn't come with explosions or medals or Hollywood lighting. It comes with a cane and a voice and the willingness to stand up when your body's telling you to sit down. If you believe that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, subscribe to this channel. If you believe that respect is earned in moments, not in titles, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you ever see an old veteran sitting on a bench at a cemetery, don't walk past. Stop. Listen. Because you never know what kind of voice is sitting there waiting to be heard.